The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.
Hello and welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Rebecca Larson, and today I'm very pleased to welcome back to the show again, Gemma Hollman. Gemma, welcome back.
Thank you very much for having me back.
Well, after the last time you were on and we spoke about women in the Middle Ages, your new book that came out, we just I think we both realized there was a lot more that we could talk about.
Definitely, it's an endless topic and something that we both enjoy talking about, so we could have gone on for hours.
Well, that's just the thing, right? Anytime you have a book which is such a huge subject matter that you're covering, there's just so much to go over. And today we're going to put a little bit more focus on nuns and mystics in the Middle Ages. So we talked about this a little bit, but this was the subject matter that you were really keen to talk about today. So why don't we start there? Like, what was it about these specific segments of your book that just drew you to it?
Yeah, I think it was a mix of things really, where I have previously written a lot of royal history. That's kind of more my specialist area, and it's an area that gets a lot of attention, and there's lots of very obvious reasons for that. We're attracted to the glitz and glamour. Just think of celebrity culture today. We love the rich and famous and powerful, and so we're going to want to hear about them in the past. And they're also the women from the Middle Ages that we tend to have the most records about, because they were the rich and powerful and important, and so they were writing and being written about and doing things. And so there's lots of history books about it, there's lots of TV shows about it. And as great as that is, sometimes obviously the sort of more lower class women don't get so much of a look in. And I really found so much interest in nuns and religious women whilst researching this book, because they kind of cut across society, because a peasant could be a nun, but so could a queen. And so it's a real cross-boundary thing. It's another way that women held a lot of power in the Middle Ages that sometimes gets missed a bit. That these women could be incredibly powerful, incredibly respected, incredibly revered, not just within their own nunnery, but internationally as well. And so I just think that there's so much to unpick there that lots of people don't always know about, and that doesn't always get that airtime that in that popular culture about religious women so much. Because again, peasants sometimes kind of come in either as background characters, or when they are breaking the molds, you think of people like Joan of Arc being this folk hero, and that kind of, there's this peasant smashing these boundaries. But yeah, I just can't really think so much of religious women getting the same kind of attention. And so I just thought it was a great opportunity to talk a bit more about them, really.
I love this. One of the things when I was reading about the mystics part of your book was how, I guess I want to say it surprised me, but it really didn't surprise me just because of how the culture was back then. But if a mystic had a vision, it was like most of the time the mystics were women, right? So
Yes.
if they had a vision, they had to take it to a male figure in the church. Let's talk about that. Because, of course, as soon as I read that, I got mad, but then remembered it was a different time.
Yeah, so as you say, it's this really weird juxtaposition of, although there were men who were mystics, it did generally become a very much female orientated thing, that far and beyond most mystics were women. And so it's this real kind of subculture way for women, and particularly nuns, to become famous and popular and respected for their visions. But as you say, it's always kind of funneled, well, almost always funneled through this male mediator. And the church at the time is obviously run by men, although there are nuns and who exist. Everyone who's powerful in the church are men. Bishops are men, priests are men who do the mass. The Pope is a man. And so women are there, but they're not in the hierarchy of the church. And there's so much anxiety in the medieval period about women. This idea that women are more likely to sin. Obviously, it was Eve who caused the downfall of man, and it's just gone downhill from there. And this idea that women are so much more emotional than men, and they're more susceptible to influences of the devil, and they're more likely to sin, and they're more likely to lead others to sin. And so throughout the medieval period, especially as nunneries grow in popularity as the period goes on, and you get hundreds and hundreds and thousands of nuns and nunneries popping up everywhere, there's so much anxiety from men in society about these groups of women gathering together, because groups of women gathering together is never a good idea. There's going to be something go wrong there. And particularly the fact that nunneries are women institutions run by women. And so there's all of these fail-safes in place that nunneries have to report to a nearby male institution, and they'll be visited by bishops and archbishops and priests to make sure that everything's running smoothly. And there's always that level of oversight. And so that's something that really transfers to mystics, that although it's the women having the visions and reporting them, it's seen that they need to be verified by the church. And there's multiple reasons for that, not just because they're women, it's because what they're saying is dangerous and a big claim, and the church need to verify that these are legitimate mystics and they're having legitimate visions, and that they're not either lying and making it up, or that they're not visions sent by the devil. It might be that they're legitimate visions, but rather than coming from God, it's coming from the devil. So they need to check these things. And obviously the people checking are going to be the men, because they're the powerful people in the church. But there's definitely another layer of legitimacy that comes from the visions being mediated through a man. And at first, this often kind of came from necessity, because some of the mystics were not literate. Even if they were nuns, they might not be able to read and write. And so, although they're having these visions, to be able to record them and spread them, you need someone to write it down for you. So they would dictate to a priest who would write it down for them. So there's that necessity aspect. But again, it's that legitimacy thing of, well, it needs to be mediated through a man and checked and maybe slightly reworded through a man, because these women also had male confessors. So every nun still needed to go to confession, talk about her religion with a priest, because as we said, it's only men in the church who are verified to do these things. And so it's kind of natural that her personal confessor, that man who she is connected to, who's her mentor, who's her personal priest, would be the one to help her record those visions. So yeah, even where you do have these powerful women doing really powerful things, there's always still that man somewhere in the sidelines that is helping to direct her or guide her or write down her visions for her.
How were these mystics received outside of the institution itself? Were they seen more as a religious icon within than they were without? How did that look?
Yeah, so mystics really gained in popularity within the lay population as well as within religious institutions. But they had a really fine line to balance, because as I said, there's all of these questions about the legitimacy of mystics, particularly as the period goes on and mystics become more and more popular and more common. The church is really keen to make sure that these things are legitimate, that these women aren't saying dangerous things or spreading dangerous ideology. So lots of women had to be really careful about what they were doing and what they were saying. And there's lots of evidence of women being very nervous about coming forwards and sharing their visions with people, and how that will then impact their lives. And this was a real serious danger. But if it was accepted that her visions were legitimate, then she would become very popular within her local region of whatever her institution is, the local town, city, sort of county region around her. People would know her name. They would ask her to pray for them. They might send her gifts. If she was within a nunnery, the nunnery would become really popular. It's kind of almost a bit like a celebrity going, like a celebrity's child going to a school or something, and like everyone wants to send their kids to that school. That happens with the nunneries as well. So if there's a really famous mystic, then people want to send their daughters, sisters, wives to that nunnery to be with that mystic, because it's like, wow, this is amazing. There's this woman touched by God, and this nunnery then is also going to get lots of money and gifts and power. So then whoever is a nun there is also going to sort of benefit from that. So there's definitely that sort of immediate region popularity, but depending on how well known the woman becomes, how widespread her teachings become, it can very much break into the secular world through books. People would buy these teachings in these books that they're writing and learn them just within the nobility and things like that. And people would travel from far and wide and from all levels of society. So the most famous mystics would even have kings and emperors come and travel to see them, and get advice from them. And this is the most important men in Europe are traveling to listen to a woman and ask her advice and ask her blessings and just listen to her speak, which is just extraordinary, really, when you think about it and when you think about the power that women had at that time. That, you wouldn't even necessarily get that from a noble woman. You're not going to have the Holy Roman Emperor travel to England because he really wants to speak to the Queen of England. Like, they might meet up and see each other, but he's not making that journey just for that. But he will go and travel and see a female mystic and listen to what she has to say because she's getting these words from God and he wants to hear what God's got to say about him. So yeah, really the sky's the limit with some of these women, and you can really see that in the legacy. Some of these women, the number of copies of their works that survive today can number into the hundreds. And when you think how few medieval texts we have and how some of the most famous texts we've got, like you think something like Beowulf or something, where there's like one or two copies that survive and they're really famous, and then these women have got hundreds of copies surviving. It shows just how prolific and popular their work was just outside the nunnery, not just within.
Yeah, I love that. I love that they were like these local celebrities, because they were touched by God. You mentioned that these, kings would travel far and wide to hear these mystics speak. But if I recall in your book, the only mystic who didn't do that, who went to a king herself, was Joan of Arc.
Yes, yeah, Joan just wanted to break all the molds that that were set there. But yeah, no, Joan is really building upon centuries of these female mystics who have come before her. She's obviously around in the 1400s. You sort of have earlier mystics from going back to 1100s. So, you've had three centuries of women sort of claiming this. But as I said, that as time goes on and as the medieval period progresses, you really get more and more. So certainly late 1300s, early 1400s, you do kind of get an explosion all across Europe of women having these visions, and it becomes a lot more widespread, a lot more well known, and it also starts to travel a bit more outside of nunneries. So obviously a lot of mystics are still already religious women, but certainly in the 15th century, you start to get a lot more ordinary women who are claiming visions from God. So you get this in England, you get this, in Spain, you get it in Italy, and it sort of opens up a new perspective and possibility of mystics. And it's probably partially from a wider education, a wider knowledge of this being a thing, because beforehand, lots of mystics being nuns, and they were particularly nuns in educated monasteries. So it's women who could read and who knew the Bible inside out and could read all these spiritual texts, and so understood their religion a lot more. And so you can kind of see then how this knowledge feeds into this mysticism. But yeah, as time progresses, you do start to get a lot more lower class women who suddenly have this real understanding and knowledge of the Bible and are able to talk about religious matters in ways that they couldn't in the past. And Joan is certainly one of the people that kind of builds upon this. But yeah, as you say, a lot of previous mystics wanted to share their lessons, but it was very much in a formalized way, as we said, writing them down, having the text spread, and then through that fame, having people come to them and asking them questions. And they might sometimes seek out leaders, they might perhaps write to their local monarch if something's going on and offer some advice, but it was that very kind of formalized, accepted way. Whereas Joan very much has this God-given mission. She believes that God has told her, you need to free France from the English. You know, this is your duty. And so that's what she's going to do. And so, yeah, she goes out of her way to go to the French court and make sure that she gets heard, and doing so in a much more forceful way in person. Obviously, she's illiterate, so she can't write down the visions. And she doesn't kind of have that immediate access to priests because she's not in a monastery. So she doesn't kind of have that more formalized route. But yeah, she just really just wants to break the mold and go out and be active with her visions. And it's not too far a departure from previous mystics. You kind of have a variety of mystics. Some have visions more of the past, so they'll have visions where they will witness scenes from the Bible. So they will witness Jesus being born, being crucified, they'll witness the Virgin Mary's birth and things like that. But other mystics do have more active visions where they are hearing messages about how to reform the church, how to reform their own monastery, directions that God is wanting the religion to move in. And so they will be proactive in that way, where they'll be telling people about this and saying, no, we need to start doing this instead. But as I said, yeah, Joan's really taking that to the next level and taking it outside of religion. You know, a lot of these nuns have been having visions telling them how the nunnery should be run, how Christianity should be run, whereas Joan is saying how the country should be run and how the army should be run and how to win the war, which again is a real kind of departure from what many other mystics have been doing up to that point.
Yeah. Well, Joan of Arc has really become like this pop culture heroine who is like the queen of female empowerment, right? She's like, look, I know this, let's go do this.
Yes. Yeah.
Also, in this section about mystics, you talk about, I think her name was Hildegard. I think she's the first one that you mentioned. I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about her. And then you have an image in that section of a crown that she had. And I would love if you touch on that as well.
Yeah, so Hildegard of Bingen is one of the most famous medieval nuns in general, and certainly mystics. And anyone who's done a little bit about the medieval period has probably heard her name because she was so famous. We're talking about sort of reputation and the effect that they can have outside of the nunnery, and she really exemplifies that because she just is so well known in her lifetime, and that just reputation carries on. And yeah, she's a really interesting example of showing the education of nuns and how some of that external influence outside of religion, that we're sort of talking a little bit with Joan of Arc, because she writes about other matters as well. So she's really educated in like science and medicine, and she writes textbooks about that as well and spreads that knowledge both within nunneries and beyond. So she's really respected for her learning aside from anything else. But yes, there's a certain artifact related to her that I just had to have in the book. Almost every single picture in the book has an image of a woman on. There's I can count on one hand the amount of images in the book that don't have a picture of a woman on. And this object is one of them, because in the Middle Ages, you have fairly standard nun like outfits, if you want to call them that, where, they might vary slightly from institution to institution and from country to country, but generally they're very simple clothes. You sort of have white undergarments with a black robe or dress or tunic on top. You've got a sort of white wimple. The forehead is covered up to the eyebrows and sort of kept around the face as well, so you're not showing off too much of your body. And this is fairly standard, but certain orders, as they develop and as time goes on, do have slight embellishments that kind of identify that order visually. Obviously it's a very visual society, and so the whole thing about what type of clothes different classes could wear, it's a very visual indicator. Well, only a noble's allowed to wear this color or this type of material. And so if that person's wearing that, that they're a noble. And that kind of feeds through a little bit to religious orders. And certain religious orders start wearing a nun's crown, which is basically strips of material that go over the headdress. And you sort of have like a sort of a circular band, and then there'll be bands going across the crown of the head that join together. And sometimes certain orders will have images within that crown as well. And so that's a way to identify certain groups. And yes, Hildegard has a crown that she has designed, that she and her nuns wear, and which she had to sort of defend the use of. But her monastery kept a crown which was allegedly Hildegard's, that she wore and owned, and kept it and revered it as a relic basically after her death, and it survives to today. And at some point a lovely blue sort of silken undercap has been put underneath just to kind of show off the structure of the crown a bit more, and sort of help keep it in nice condition and help with sort of displaying it. But it's the only surviving medieval nun's crown that we have, and the reason it survived is because of this association of it with Hildegard, that, as I said, it almost takes on this relic-like status, that people want to protect it and look after it because it was Hildegard's, and that's the reason that we've got it today. And so that in itself is just a really great example, just visually, in terms of the art, in terms of material culture, but then again in terms of that whole story of how this one woman was so powerful for her religion and her beliefs and her knowledge, that something has survived today, the only one of its kind, purely because it belonged to her, which, yeah, I just think is really great.
Yeah, it's quite extraordinary too. And you see the picture and how you just described how they would be dressed. I can visually see it in my mind what this crown would have looked like on top of their outfit, or whatever you
Mm.
call it, uniform. I know there's a name for it. Somebody is screaming right now listening to this, going, "This is what it's called." So if you know, send it in, let me know. Are there any other anecdotes or bits from the book on the section on mystics that you would like to cover before we dive right into nuns?
Yeah, I think just sort of, we've touched upon the power that mystics could wield. But as I said, there is very much a double-edged sword with this, where women had to be so careful what they said, what they claimed, and how they acted with these visions. Because although they could have this amazing life and status and become saints and venerated for these visions, as I said, the church was very skeptical and very scared about women having such power. We are talking about people coming from far and wide to listen to them, to take their advice. And changes in the church were happening because of some of these women. In local areas, women might suggest some reforms, and the church would be like, yeah, okay, let's do that. If you say that you're hearing this from God, then I guess we better do it then. We don't want to not do what God's telling us to do. So they did have a lot of power, and it was dangerous because they were women, because it could be coming from the devil, because it might go against what the church is teaching people. They don't want to be contradicted by a random woman being like, nah, the church is wrong. Don't listen to the Pope, listen to me.
Yeah.
And as I said, some of the things they are saying is really dangerous. There's a French mystic, Marguerite, I think it was the late 1300s. And she is there saying that because she's a mystic and she's got a direct line from God, she doesn't need the church to be giving her sacraments, because she's already directly connected to God. And obviously that's such a dangerous thing for someone to be saying. The church doesn't want people going around saying, yeah, you don't need the church. Like, you can just talk to God. That really undermines their position. And so there are consequences for women who are seen to be lying, who are seen to be having visions instead from the devil, who are seen to be saying things contrary to church teaching. And it can be really serious. They can be punished, they can be excommunicated. Certain women, like Marguerite, actually end up being executed as heretics for what they're saying. And this is even women, we sort of say that she's like saying these outrageous things, but these are women who actually do have support within the church. Marguerite, after the first time she got told to stop saying what she's saying, she sent her writings to some of the most revered theologians at the time, and they all agreed with what she was saying and said, yeah, this sounds fine. And she still got executed. So, just having backing of men in the church is not necessarily enough. And it can be really dangerous. And so you do see this real anxiety amongst these female mystics about how they're being perceived because they are scared about what it might sort of impact on them. And so you do have women sort of being really careful, only writing things down under a lot of encouragement, sometimes from the Pope himself saying, yep, no, that's fine. Like, we believe you, you can write it down. But, people who don't have that backing can be really quite anxious. I mean, an example is Julian of Norwich, who's an English mystic, and she, is really clearly anxious in her writings and sort of says in some of them, well, I'm not trying to be a teacher because obviously women are not allowed to be teachers. So I'm not trying to be a teacher, but I'm just writing down some things that I've seen, but please don't misinterpret anything that I'm saying. And, like, this isn't just her covering her back, this is her being like, oh my God, please, like, I'm not trying to break any church rules here. I'm just trying to write down what I'm seeing. So I think it is also really important to remember that side of it, of just how serious these matters were, and that it wasn't just an easy out for someone to pretend like, oh yeah, I can see visions from God. Like, you should listen to me and I'll get loads of power and be this really great famous lady and everyone will love me. Like, it could be really dangerous. And Joan of Arc is a perfect example. Absolutely revered in France. They love her. She's winning. Gets taken by the English and they say, no, she's a heretic. She's a witch. She's lying about all these visions that she's seeing. And and then burns at the stake as well. So yeah, I think it is easy to kind of romanticize and be like, yeah, this is such a great way for women to get power and influence, but it could be very dangerous. And women were very aware of that fact and did take many steps to mitigate it. And going back to the very first thing you said about the sort of men getting involved, although sometimes you do sort of go, well, why can't they just listen to the woman? Why do they need a man? Actually, in lots of cases, that is a way for the woman to protect herself, to say, this isn't just me saying this priest has written it down and he's read it and he thinks that it sounds okay. And then this got passed on to my local bishop and he read it and he said it was okay. So I'm not being a heretic against the church because all these men agree with me. So it could actually be a defense for them as much as an intrusion.
Yeah, for sure. So the last time you were on, I think the question I asked you at the end is if you could be any of the medieval women, which would you pick? And I think we both picked we would want to be a nun, didn't we?
Yes, we
Yeah,
did.
but I don't want to be a mystic who's a nun.
That's fair enough.
Let's talk about being a nun. Who could become a nun, and how and who were the people that would end up in these convents? How did that look? Because we know it wasn't just people who woke up one day and said, I'm going to be a nun. There were many other variations of people who came to convents. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, I think that's something that is really interesting about the period is certainly as time goes on, just how accessible being a nun was to women at all stages of life and all stages of society. So the period of the book covers about 1000 to about 1500, and at the start of that period, it's a lot more limited who can become a nun. There's not many nunneries across Europe at all. And so these very limited institutions tend to be for royal women, princesses, queens, maybe the very higher levels of society, because there's so few going, there's not many places, and these institutions don't have these big endowments to sustain them. So you need someone who's wealthy who can bring land and money to the nunnery. And so they're much more closed off institutions that are sort of retirement homes in a way, or sort of, just ways for princesses who don't want to marry for whatever reason to have like another career path almost. But as time goes on, and particularly in the 12th century, there's a really big religious revival across Europe. And there's this explosion in religious orders being created, and with that comes an explosion in monasteries and nunneries, and institutions both for men and women explode within this, but particularly for women. And you really just see within a relatively short space of time, these numbers, just as I said, just explode. I mean, if you look at England, for example, at the time of the Norman Conquest, there's fewer than 10 nunneries in the whole of England. And then in the 12th century, so just the following century, over 100 nunneries get set up. So it really is just like a huge explosion is the only word for it. I've used it a few times, but that's it. And so suddenly there's a lot more opportunities and options. It's open to a wider range of women because there's just simply more spaces around. The fact that you've got these religious orders also means that there's more choices. So before, obviously, if you've only got a handful of nunneries to choose from, you're not really choosing, you're just going wherever there's a space and wherever will take you. But these religious orders all kind of, although they all fall under Roman Catholicism, they follow slightly different ways of life. So the teachings and the beliefs are the same, but the way that you express that is different. So some religious orders will really emphasize charity and community work. And so they'll be based in towns and cities, and they'll go out and do things, and they'll run hospitals, and they'll help the poor, and are really active in that way. And other institutions and other orders prefer solitude and silence and prayer and reflection, and they'll be located out in the middle of nowhere, and they'll be locked away, and they won't have any outside visitors, and they'll spend all day in prayer. And others really value education, and so they'll educate their nuns and teach them, and they can read and write, and others don't care about that at all, and so their nuns are completely uneducated. And so all of those means that women have more choice in how they want to express themselves. So if they find themselves aligned with the values and ways of life of one particular order over another, they can choose to go to that order. So you kind of have all of these options opening up. And with that, you have a much broader range of society that can come in. And really, the thing that's quite striking is that anyone could become a nun at any stage of her life, really. So you kind of have this traditional idea of children being designated at birth or as young children for life in the church. And that does happen, certainly to an extent, particularly in noble families. If you've got lots and lots of children, as you sort of start to get into the teen numbers of children, you might start to think, okay, this one can become a priest, this one can become a nun. So you do have that to an extent, and people sort of grow up dedicated for that, and they will go off, be sent off as children to live in religious institutions and learn their way of life, and then take their vows when they're old enough. But they can really join at any stage of life. So you even have married women joining convents. If they want to take religious orders, they have to have the marriage dissolved. And so that means that they need their husband's permission. But this did happen in quite a few cases, that women really wanted to go and live a religious life, and their husband granted permission for her to do so and dissolve the marriage in that way. You also have lots of married couple who decide to join religious institutions together. And so, they've both decided that they both want to dedicate their lives to God. And so they will join together. They might enter a joint monastery where there's men and women housed there, or they might just go their separate ways to different institutions and agree mutually, actually, I'm going to become a priest, you're going to become a nun, and we're going to dedicate our lives to God. So that is another option. Obviously, widows are quite numerous in the Middle Ages. You've got lots of war and disease. And so a woman could be widowed at any age. She could be widowed as a child. She could be widowed as a very old lady. And so widowhood is a very popular time for women to enter a nunnery. And this can be kind of under two different strands. So one strand might be that the woman had always wanted to live a religious life, but societal pressures, family pressures, particularly if she's a noble, that she is expected, no, you need to marry for the family, we need this alliance, we need this land, it's just what you need to do, you need to create heirs. So it might be that she had followed her family duty and expectations to marry, but now that she's done that, she's like, all right, I did what you wanted to do, now it's my turn to do what I want to do, so I'm going to go become a nun. But then you also kind of have the other side where you do have these older women who have had lots of children. They've been a wife for many years, and actually a nunnery is acting in a way like a retirement home, even if she's not necessarily very old by that point. But it's a way to be like, okay, I've done the hard bit of life. I've risked my life giving birth. I've been a wife. I've led the family. I've done all these things. And actually now I want time for myself and I want a quieter life. And I don't want the pressure of maybe remarrying, and I want a chance to be surrounded by women my age. It's very much a community thing that you're there with lots of other women. And so it's a real sisterhood. And lots of families had someone in their extended family who was already in a religious institution. So that can be very literal. It might be a chance for them to go and join a sister or an aunt or a cousin who is a nun, and they can go live together and they can be a family and have all of that. And so there's really kind of opportunities at all stages of life for women to become a nun, and so many different reasons why they might want to do that as well.
Yeah, well, of course, the first one that comes to mind when you're talking about this is Elizabeth Woodville.
Mm.
The mother of Elizabeth of York, the wife of Edward IV. Was her reasoning into this next chapter in her life because it would be some security and stability compared to what she had had?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, yeah, you look at Elizabeth Woodville and God, what a life. I mean, she sort of has this rise through the ranks. She's living through the center of a civil war. Her life's in danger at various times. She's having children locked away in sanctuary because she could possibly be killed if she leaves the walls of sanctuary. She's had her children possibly murdered in the Tower of London. She's had other children and she's had siblings as well be killed during this fighting. She's kind of managed to live long enough. She's outlived her husband. She's managed to see her daughter married and put back on the throne. And you just kind of go, God, no wonder she doesn't want to be at court anymore. Like, you'd be running from court by that point. And yeah, so retiring to a nunnery is a great way to do that. And particularly for noble and royal women, there are other opportunities within nunneries that aren't just becoming a nun. So particularly towards the end of the medieval period, there's a sort of thing called a vowess, where it's basically named after the fact that they have to take one vow, which is that of chastity. Because as we mentioned, these women in these religious institutions are very carefully guarded and their chastity is very important, and they don't want any outside influences affecting that, even from other women. And if women are going to be coming within the walls of these nunneries, they need to be highly moral women who aren't going to lead the nuns astray from all of the life experience that they've had. And so it's a way for these very rich, noble women to join a nunnery and have the benefits of that, have the security, the safety, the way of life, the sisterhood, without taking those vows to officially become a nun. So if she's done this vow of poverty and chastity and things like that, she can live with the nuns, but she's still allowed to keep her worldly goods. She can still travel outside of the walls. She can still receive visitors. So it's very much a best of both worlds kind of situation. And yeah, that's the kind of situation that Elizabeth finds herself in. And she retires to an institution that other female members of the royal family have done so in the past. And so sorry. um, and yeah, and so she's kind of following in those footsteps of other royal women. And yeah, it's just a way to live a bit of a quieter life, really. I mean, there's talks at one point of her son-in-law going to be marrying her off to the King of Scotland, and I can just imagine her being like, "Oh God, no, I can't, not another king.
Right.
I don't want to deal with that. Just please let me go to the nunnery." Yeah, but no, that and that's not a unique case. It is very much a thing that women across Europe did do in their widowhood, to as we said, to get just some of that peace and quiet and security without having to go all the way of completely vowing yourself to God for the rest of your life.
She must have gotten rid of most of her earthly goods since at the end of her life in her will, she didn't have much to leave, did she?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, as I said, although these women could keep their goods and their luxuries with them, and there were definitely some women who were just basically living in a stately home, but it's a nunnery, and having all these luxurious tapestries and fine clothes. There were others who did very much take on the lifestyle of the nuns and who did sort of get rid of most of their goods and give away their lands and either donating them to the nunnery or just leaving them to other family members, and yeah, really embracing that thing of poverty, because as much as we think about royal women and noble women at the time having these really luxurious privileged lives, and why would you ever want to give that up, actually a lot of them did. A lot of them didn't like the fact that they had so much more than everybody else. The church is teaching charity and poverty, and that this is a way to get to heaven. The whole thing about, the rich man can't get through the eye of the needle, the camel can get through the eye of the needle better than the rich man can enter heaven, kind of thing. And so that is something that some of these women have lived these lives. They've been at court, they've traveled the world, they've had all these luxuries, and actually decide that's really not right. And actually, I'm not better than anyone else, and I shouldn't be focusing on worldly goods. I should be thinking about my spiritual health. And so yeah, either getting rid of that altogether and becoming nuns or setting up nunneries, or at the very least living much more reduced lives of poverty. And yeah, Elizabeth certainly seems to have done that, because as you say in her will, she sort of just goes, well, I don't really have any stuff to give you, so I give you my love, guys, kind of thing, and just wants a very simple funeral as well. So yeah, it is very much something that lots of women did do, and did do very earnestly. And yeah, I just truly did believe, actually, no, we shouldn't be having all of these worldly goods, and we should just be living simple lives that are just dedicated to God and the community.
Yeah. Well, I have to get in. So you talked about chastity, obviously, and you probably know where I'm going with this because one of the subjects that has always intrigued me when it comes to nuns and monks and priests and when you have these people together is that the sin comes into the picture, doesn't it? And
Yeah.
it might not always be the woman who is the serpent in the garden. Let's touch base a little bit on nuns becoming pregnant, maybe how that could have happened and what happened to them after they discovered they were pregnant.
Yeah, so I mean, as we said, people were very anxious about what would happen to women in these communities. And so, very early on, as soon as you get this explosion in nunneries and female institutions across Europe, there's very quickly lots of legislation and attempts to secure those women. And so, you get what's called cloistering or enclosure. And it's this idea that women need to be physically locked away to protect them. So yeah, very much in the earlier periods, this is very literal. They have walls built around their institutions. They are locked in. They are not allowed to leave. Many of them can only communicate with the outside world through grills and windows in their institution. Doors are only opened when a new nun is coming in, or when a nun has died and is coming out again. And this can actually lead to some quite extreme examples. There's a monastery in Austria in the mid 1100s where a fire breaks out, and the head monk can't find the keys to the women's quarters to let them out and free them, and they are at danger of burning to death, and they literally have to break down the door to free these women. So it is very literally, they are locked away and set apart from the world, to protect them from sin, basically. But as we said, they still have to interact with men, because it's priests who are able to administer the Eucharist, who are able to take confession, who are able to do last rites, to do all of those sort of important everyday things that the nuns need doing for their spiritual health. So there is always a level of interaction with men. And again, there's safeguards with that. So even if a nun is interacting with a priest, she's still not meant to be by herself. She's meant to have a companion who's meant to be a respected older lady in the convent. You know, this kind of idea of the sort of the auntie kind of looking after the young niece that you might see in like period romances or something, you know, this kind of chaperone type thing is still happening within the convents. But as time goes on, this idea of cloistering and enclosure tends to become a little bit more symbolic. So you do still have institutions that are locked away, but there's a lot more free movement with the nuns. There's more movement of people able to come into the nunneries to visit. They're able to actually sit in rooms with men, with priests, particularly for things like, as we said, with mystics, you know, they might be giving their visions to a man. They might be writing books with the priests of the institution in the same room. So there's a lot more mixing that goes on. And so, yes, inevitably, there's a lot more mixing of a different kind going on. And yeah, it's quite interesting, really, because obviously there is definitely a level of female agency in this, of women who might have become nuns for the wrong reason, who might not have necessarily have wanted to become nuns and have been pushed towards that life path, and so don't really want to follow all of the rules strictly, because it's not just sexual rules that are being bent. You know, there are rules about poverty going on where women who are nuns are actually having quite luxurious clothes, they're having jewelry, they're having pets, they're having possessions. So there's lots of rule breaking that does go on. And there's also obviously there's going to be a level of as you sort of alluded to, of more the male side of thing, of there will be men who are forcing themselves on these nuns and they are unwilling relationships. And when we sort of think about our modern ideas of consent, you know, you also have to consider power balances as well, of even if it is seemingly consensual on the nun's side, she is a woman who is locked away and is maybe seeing one man in her life ever who has a lot of power over her. And so, you know, how balanced and consensual are those relationships in reality is another question to ask. But yeah, inevitably there are nuns who fall pregnant from these relations. And of course, they are very big scandals within the church, particularly as we sort of said, a lot of the time the fathers are fellow religious men because they're the only men that they're coming into contact with. So it's a kind of scandal on both sides, really. And so there's various punishments in place for women who have sinned in this way. And a lot of that can vary based on how severe the sin is seen to be, her actions in it. You know, is this a one-time thing? Is this a long-term affair? Has she had accomplices helping her to hide this relationship? Obviously, lots of nuns try to obtain abortions to get rid of the baby and conceal the birth if they have given birth. And so there's associated sins and punishments from that. So yeah, punishments can really vary based on actions and outcomes. And so it might just be that she gets a bit of a slap on the wrist. It might be that she has to be supervised much more closely within her institution. She might be moved to another institution, so there might be other institutions that are seen as much more proper and well controlled, and they've got a proper woman in charge who looks after her nuns and keeps them in line, so she might be moved there. She might be moved somewhere very undesirable. There's one nun who has helped a fellow nun have a relationship with a man, and she also helped her to try and get an abortion after she got pregnant, and as punishment just for being an accomplice to all of that, she's sent to a leper house to work in a leper house. And so obviously this is a very undesirable place to be. So that's kind of her punishment. At the most extreme level, you do have things like excommunication and being removed from the church. But this is really the most severe punishment. In general, the church really tries to keep the nuns within the church because dedicating yourself to God in that way is seen as a lifetime commitment. It's not something that you can just be like, I don't want to be a nun anymore, actually. I'm just going to leave. And so they can't just kick people out. You know, this is, no, you have taken a sacred vow to God and this is your life now. And so they do really try and do whatever they can to discipline the nun within the hierarchy of the church. So excommunication and things like that is really for the most heinous crimes, really. So yeah, it's very much kind of punishment within their institution or being moved elsewhere for their sins.
Wow. You would think, right, life as a nun would be simple and easy, and clearly it wasn't that. They had their own problems to deal with, but they also did a lot of good. Like you said, in the community, they were able to get out and help people. Um, I'm trying to remember um, what we talked about in the last episode as far as the nun stuff went, because I don't want to repeat too much. But on any given day, what would their life have looked like? Would it have been spent mostly in prayer, or helping the community, or did it just depend on which nunnery they were in?
Yeah, I mean, there definitely was a lot based on which institution they were at and which order they were part of. Um, for any institution, prayer is a very big part of it. They will be spending hours a day in prayer. They will most likely be attending daily mass, and not just daily mass, but several times a day. They'll be sort of partaking in different spiritual hours. The day's kind of divided up into different tasks at different times of day, so they'll be involved in that. There'll be a lot of contemplation and time for spiritual reflection. So particularly those who are in cloistered nunneries, they'll have the gardens that they can wander around and think about religion and their spirituality. Lots of nunneries have daily meetings to talk about their spiritual health, where they can discuss things they might be struggling with, any sins they might have done. They can talk about scripture and all sorts of things to do with their religion there. And then, yeah, beyond that, it then really gets influenced by where they are and the institution. So if they're in a rural one, they might have farm animals to tend to, because many nuns did have to do ordinary work, although there were servants and labourers around who might help cook the food, clean the clothes, tend to animals, things like that. A lot of nuns are expected to get their hands dirty and do that as well. So they will have chores, they'll have cleaning, they'll have mending their clothes. Lots of institutions engaged in artwork, so they might have tapestries that they're weaving or clothes that they're sewing, like vestments for priests. They might be a very educated institution, so they might be off writing books or copying books or creating artwork for books to send to different nunneries or to have their own copies. As you said, if they're one that's much more in the community, then they might be doing some outreach. They might be giving charity to the poor. They might have a hospital that they're running, so they might be caring for the sick and feeding them. They might have visitors to the nunnery, particularly if they've got like relics or if they've got a mystic and they're having pilgrims for whatever reason, then they'll be caring for the pilgrims as well. So there's a real variety of work that does go on, and yeah, it does really vary based on region to region, but at the heart of all of them is obviously just that religious side of praying, and nuns' prayers are powerful currencies. They are seen as something that makes a difference, and there's this belief in purgatory and that most people are not going straight to heaven. They're going to have to wait for hundreds if not thousands of years in purgatory, and prayers can help speed up that process. And so the sort of patrons of institutions might ask for prayers. Nuns might pray for their family members to help their family members through, which is particularly important for widows who become nuns. They'll be praying for their deceased spouse, for their parents, and things like that. Kings and queens can pay monasteries to have prayers said for their souls, either just in general or if something important's happening. If the king's fallen sick, then the court will pay institutions across the country to say prayers for his soul, for his recovery. And so it's a very important aspect of their lives is praying and being part of the mass. And poverty again is fairly universal across institutions across Europe, and across this period. That although, as we said, there are more wealthy institutions, there are ones that flout the rules a bit. There are institutions that are much more for very upper nobility to be part of that are going to be having much more luxurious lives. In general, it is expected that nunneries and female religious institutions have a level of poverty. And so that means not having worldly goods, living simple lives. And so all of the sort of associated lifestyles with that sort of come in as well.
Gemma, I love it when you're on the show and we get to talk about these medieval women, and there's never enough time to talk about everything. But I want to make sure that if people didn't see or hear the first episode we did together, I'm going to put the link to that in the show notes so that you can also catch up on that one. We kind of covered a little bit more like what the book is about in general. But for those who this is their first time tuning in, you want them to know about your book. What can you tell them is inside your book?
Yeah, so the book is an illustrated general history of women in the later medieval period. And yeah, as I said, it covers Europe. It's mostly sort of Western and Central Europe, the sort of areas that are Roman Catholic during this period. And it looks at women from all levels of society, so from peasants up till queens, obviously including religious women, but looking at artists and writers, looking at ordinary peasant women, housewives, nobles, rulers, and the sort of unifying aspect of it is medieval artwork. So there's nearly 200 images in the book. And they're all contemporary pieces of art. So it's manuscript drawings, it's paintings, it's stained glass, it's things like the nun's crown that we mentioned, various artifacts like that. So you've got like chests and jewelry boxes and just all amazing aspects of medieval art that in such a visual society did permeate just everyday life, and really looking at linking the written record and the artwork and seeing how, looking at both these sources together, you can really reveal women's lives. And so it's a kind of whirlwind through a variety of countries and centuries and just looking at what was life like for women during this time and picking out particular case studies of particular women that we know about and showing how that shines a light on what life was like for all different types of women during that period. So it's a very beautiful book, if I do say so myself. Lots of very big page, colourful images. It's an oversized book, so you can really see the detail in some of these pieces of art. So every time you open it up, there's something different to have a look at in there. So yes, definitely do check it out.
It is a wonderful book. I have to purchase the physical hard copy because I must have this. I just have the ebook version at the moment. But you said, about being in a visual society. We are in a visual society right now. And so this book is like perfect timing because not only can you learn about this time in history and these women, but you get to see these images that go along with it too. And I feel like I just like fangirl over you every time you're on this show, but I really enjoyed this book. I highly recommend that everybody go out and get a copy today. And Gemma, thank you so much for being on the show today again.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me back. It's always fun to talk about it.
And that concludes another episode of the Tudors Dynasty podcast. Thank you so much for listening. If you love the show and would like to show your support, consider becoming a patron over on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Tudors Dynasty. Over there, you'll get commercial-free episodes, early access, and some patron exclusive content as well. If you would prefer to show your support in another way, head on over to my website, tudorsdynasty.com, and click on the shop to see some of the new merchandise that I have available. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.
The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.